Due to some unusual circumstances, Dr. Waters had to bow out of the class at the last minute. The class was conducted by his colleague, Professor of Philosophy, Dr. Dennis Bonnet, who was brought in at the last minute and had virtually no time for preparation.
What I'm going to do tonight is I'm going to touch on a few metaphysical points that I thought might be a little interesting. My approach to them may be a little bit different from Dr. Waters. And you're welcome to ask questions, because if you ask questions, it will use up time, and I won't have to be prepared. But again, bear in mind, no preparation, therefore I have no order in my mind, or even in writing, as to how to treat any of these topics. I don't know if that will allow you to not throw tomatoes at me when we're done, but...
We weren't prepared.
We're not prepared either. Well, that's true. That's true.
Do you think we'll know the difference?
You have a point.
Do you think we know the difference?
You may know the difference by the time I'm done. Okay, any questions? Well, I had to start somewhere. No, that's okay.
I'm glad to be with you.
Quite frankly, that's one of the things missing is student participation.
Well, you're going to have a lot of it tonight. Yes, by all means, go ahead. Do we normally give the date on these?
Dr. Waters does.
Yes, this. You already did? Okay, cool. The first thing I wanted to do is just to make a couple points regarding the first principles that we have in metaphysics. And again, the sort of thing I'm going to be dealing with are overviews, because if I try to give you specifics, you'll find out how much I don't remember. The one point I really want to make is that philosophy and metaphysics is really simple. You probably don't think so, but it's simple in this sense. And, I always think if somebody has to explain something to you in such a complicated way that they can't simplify it, usually it means they don't understand it themselves. And this is what I have long suspected of Immanuel Kant. If you've ever tried to read something like the Critique of Pure Reason, you wonder why on earth he couldn't reduce it to simple language. Why on earth he couldn't reduce it to simple examples. One of the things I always noticed about the Critique of Pure Reason is he never seems to talk about dogs or trees or fire hydrants. Maybe they didn't have any. But I've long suspected there was a reason behind it, and that is that in his philosophy, he is using a system whereby everything gets filtered by these a priori forms of all possible cognition, and they're universal filters. So everything gets filtered through things like causality and substance and accidents and time and place, and these are all broad categories, and you don't really know anything about the things themselves except through these broad categories, which raises a really nasty question. How do you know the individual natures of the individual things that you encounter and experience? How do you get the dogginess out of a dog? Do you have a universal filter category for dogginess? Not in his system. I think he has a real problem explaining how we know the individual natures of things, and indeed how we get universal concepts of them. So he just never talks about them.
I was just going to ask that. Does he try to talk about them and not, or he just ignores them?
He virtually ignores them, which makes it almost impossible to understand him. Because everything is done in these wonderful universal categories which function like filters of the mind by which everything is given its universal content. But then the problem comes, do you have a universal filter for every individual object in the world? Horse, dog, cow, chicken? And if not, then how are you supposed to know them? It's just a big glaring gap. Not to mention the fact also that he tells us, I shouldn't get into Kant, he tells us that you're not supposed to be able to engage in metaphysics or other transcendental sciences sciences that go beyond the direct sense experience that we have. And yet he comes up with a proof for his system which presupposes the transcendental validity of the principle of non-contradiction. So he's actually using something that he says you can't do. In other words, he's engaging in a transcendental application of pure reason, which he spends the rest of his books telling you can't do. But anyway, we're not talking about can't, because by and large, that's probably a waste of time. But I was trying to say how in philosophy and metaphysics, everything reduces to the simple. All those metaphysical principles, causality, sufficient reason, finality, a whole bunch of them that Dr. Waters put up here for you, if you analyze them closely enough, they all reduce just to being. That's all they are. You're starting with the fundamental encounter with being in lived experience, and from that, you build these principles. They are defensible, but in a very real sense, they are defensible because if you deny them, reality becomes meaningless. It ceases to be intelligible at all. Fundamentally, you can go all the way back to Parmenides in ancient Greek philosophy, where he tells us that you do not get being from non-being. He, of course, also insists that becoming is impossible. I'm not going to probably go into that one. But he gave us the principal insight. Being is. Non-being is not. Everything comes from that. Everything does. The principle of sufficient reason, or well, of course, first of all, the principle of non-contradiction, is simply a combination of the affirmative principle that being is and non-being is not. So you say that the same being cannot both be and not be at the same time and in the same respect. If you try to allow that something can both be and not be, it ceases to be meaningful. I always used to use the example of, like, if you put chocolate ice cream and milk into the same container. The chocolate isn't the white milk. The white milk isn't the brown chocolate. If they were, it would be like turning the blender on, and of course you wind up with something that's halfway between. There's no intelligibility, there's no structure in the world if things can both be and not be. And the irony is, I've even seen some contemporary physics trying to use things like quantum mechanics to attack the principle of non-contradiction. But, of course, in just presenting their arguments, they presuppose it. Every time you utter a sentence, every time you think a thought, you affirm what you're saying, which implicitly denies the contradiction. Otherwise, it would be utterly meaningless. David Hume attacks the principle of causality, but he writes a book doing it. How do you write a book without using English words like because? And what are you saying? You know, this is because of that. You're using the principle of causality. This is the reason for that. X is the reason for Y. You can't write a book and have it make any sense without presupposing causality. You can't write a book and have it make any sense without presupposing the principle of non-contradiction, because every statement you make, if it's to be meaningful, has to be opposing its contradictory. Otherwise, the book is pure gibberish. It means nothing. But again, to come back to the basic principle of being, you can develop, as Garrigou-Lagrange does in God, His Existence, and His Nature, and as Maritain does in the Principles of Metaphysics, you can start with the principle of identity. Being is what it is. And from it, you can unfold the principle of non-contradiction. Being cannot both be and not be. And from that, you can show the principle of sufficient reason, because a thing cannot be and yet lack that in virtue of which it is distinguished from nothing. And then if you take the principle of sufficient reason, once you have that, causality is just a matter of unpacking it. Because you ask, where's the reason? If a thing isn't its own reason, then where's the reason? Something else has got to be its reason. So it's either its own reason, or there's something else that is its reason, or it's partially its own reason and partially something else. But the two partials have to equal 100, or you don't have a sufficient reason, 100%. And if a thing isn't fully its own reason, then it needs something else to explain it. What do we call that something else? What do we call a thing which is not fully explaining itself? That's where we get the notions of effect and cause. An effect is simply a being whose sufficient reason for being is not entirely contained within itself. To the extent that it does not explain itself, it needs something else. To the extent that it does not fully explain itself, it is an effect. And the extrinsic sufficient reason is the cause of that effect. Let's say you had a thing that somehow, just doing it hypothetically, let's say you had a thing that explained itself 90%. 10% it didn't. With respect to that 10%, it needs something extrinsic to it, other than it, to explain that 10%. The 10% of it is the effect of that extrinsic sufficient reason, which we call a cause. So it would be 10% an effect of some external cause, and 90% explaining itself. Now please notice, I don't give you any examples. I don't need to give you any examples. This is why when you find people arguing in terms of examples, they get all wrapped up in the examples. The way I like to do metaphysics is just by thinking about being itself and analyzing the content along the lines that I just was doing. And you can do the same thing with the principle of finality. Every agent must act for an end. If it's going to act for an end, the end doesn't exist yet. If the end doesn't exist yet, how can the agent act for it? How can it be, as it were, oriented toward the end, but the end doesn't exist in any way, shape, or manner to explain the orientation? See, it has to exist somehow. So if an agent is going to act, let's say, for, let's say it's got the alternatives of outcome 1 or 2. You don't know ahead of time where it's going to go, but by the time it gets to the end, let's say it goes to 2, there has to be a sufficient reason not only why it acted, but why it got to where it got, as opposed to number 1. If it gets to 2 rather than 1, there's got to be a reason why it got to 2 rather than 1. And that reason must have been operative when it was acting. Otherwise, there'd be no reason, sufficient reason to make it get to that end as opposed to the other. So in some way, the end influences the agent before it even begins to act. Very mysterious. Now, the simple way to put it is, since the end doesn't exist ahead of time in the real order, the only other place it could exist would be in the intentional order, in the mind, in somebody's mind, somewhere. But again, notice, the principle's reduced to being. You're always looking for the reason. And if you don't find the reason here, it's got to be there. So there's got to be a reason when an agent acts, why it gets to this end rather than that. See, it boils back down to, you're looking for the being. Where does the being come from? What's it based in? If you have being without any reason whatever, you have no way of distinguishing existence from non-existence. So even the principle of finality, you're just tweaking the principle of being needing a reason. Being being different from non-being. The principle of double effect, which we used in ethics, you can look at that metaphysically also. Because what are you doing? You're trying to act towards the good. The good is another name for being, as you know. So you're acting towards being. You want to act towards being in such a way that you don't become responsible directly for seeking evil. What's evil? A sort of non-being. Not absolute non-being, but relative non-being. It's the lack of a being that ought to be in something. Bank tellers are supposed to work with the money honestly and not put it in their pocket. It's a defect of their virtue as a bank teller if they're siphoning off funds, I think. So the principle of double effect, what does it say? You've got to intend the good effect. You've got to be aiming for the good. You may tolerate the evil side effect, but you can't will it. You can't even take pleasure in it. That's a terrible thought, isn't it? That's why when Dr. Waters was talking about capital punishment, even if you have to execute somebody, you're not allowed to enjoy it. You might take the legitimate satisfaction that justice is being done, but you ought not be taking satisfaction in the suffering of the person being executed. It may be hard sometimes. So in every application, all the principles you see running through philosophy, if you understand them fully, they reduce down to simple principles, and they reduce ultimately to an analysis in terms of being. And that's why metaphysics is the ultimate rational science. Okay, do you have any questions to get me off this?
Stay on it.
Pardon?
Stay on it.
Oh, well, I told you I don't have much material, so I'm going to run out very easily. Okay, so my first point was that all principles reduce to being.
I have a question. I don't know if this would be, this is maybe an example, which you don't want. But when we talk about God.
I'm not against examples.
Okay. When we talk about God, we use the same kind of language. So when you were talking about, because I haven't mastered the principle of finality.
Neither have I.
Okay. So we would say, you say that all beings, no, all creatures act toward an end, or all beings act toward an end. Would you restate the principle of finality?
Most of these principles can be stated several ways.
Okay.
One of them is every agent must act for an end.
Every agent must act for an end.
Yeah.
Okay, so when we talk about God, we say God created us for an end. And that end is eternal happiness with him. Is that
Right. That's our end.
That's right.
His end is the manifestation of his glory,
His end
which happens also to be nice for us.
is a manifestation of his glory.
So God cannot act for an end outside of himself, because any end outside of himself is less than himself and therefore not worthy of his action. So that's where you get into the application of some of these things. The Baltimore Catechism is pretty accurate.
They said no love and serve. He made us to know, love, and serve him, to live with him forever.
That's right. He made us to do that. That's our end, not his end.
Thank you.
His end is his own glory.
But you can see the application of these things. Obviously, when you're dealing with God, it's just fascinating to see how these principles apply. They are transcendentally valid, even applying to God, and primarily applying to God because they don't apply to God. He is the paradigm from which all other applications ensue.
He made us for that end. Why did he make sensitive souls and vegetative souls? What is their end?
Well,
But it's all a manifestation of his glory.
Yeah,
Yeah, I'll
that
say that.
they manifest his glory by participating in the perfection of God in whatever way they do according to their nature. Again, you've got to remember that you have to take away the negative aspect of the creature. The creature does it in a limited way, what God does in an infinite way.
Didn't he make them for us too?
Sure, he made them for us too. There's no conflict between these things.
Yeah, right.
There's no conflict between us attaining happiness and God achieving his purpose.
Right, and sometimes sometimes it sounds as though he's not being altruistic, and he's
Right.
just being selfish because he wants to manifest his own blessings. But no, it's of his nature that he cannot do anything less than give himself glory.
Right.
So everything that he does is to give himself glory, but that spills over to our end.
Exactly. And I know one of my colleagues at the University of Dayton that told me he came home from giving a class in metaphysics to his students, and the students asked him something about why did God make us, and he said, well, he made us because he wanted us to be happy. And then he came home and looked it up and realized he taught pure heresy. But it sounded like the right answer. It sounded like the answer everybody expects.
Otherwise, it sounds like he's not good.
Right.
And that's,
But I remember too, years ago, St. Thomas, this might ring a bell with you, might be able to give me the exact quote, but St. Thomas, talking about God acting for his own glory, explains that God must do this because if he acted for his own glory, yet there was someone higher than him. You remember that part of St. Thomas?
No.
If there was someone greater than him, then God would be unjust in acting for his own glory, the way it's unjust for us to act for our own glory. But because he is the highest of all, then he is only being just.
Yes,
and
absolutely.
true by acting for his own glory.
We measure virtue usually in terms of our human status. And therefore we misunderstand what God is doing that is virtuous. His rules are different. If you're God, it's okay to think you're God. Okay. Let's run on to a different topic for a few minutes. Regarding causality and the proofs for God's existence, I just want to re-emphasize a couple points because sometimes we tend to forget them. And that is, please remember that the causality in those proofs is simultaneous. It's here and now. It's not a regression through time. People often forget and they go back to thinking, oh, it's going back through time, and then they get into all kinds of puzzles about how do you know that there's got to be a first if you go back and back? And the nasty little answer is there doesn't have to be. You could go back to infinity through time. It's entirely possible. The proofs are vertical. They start with effects that exist now, and we're trying to understand them in terms of causes existing now. So the impossibility of infinite regress arises from the fact that you're dealing with a series of proper causes, all operating at the same instant. It's very hard for us to imagine things operating at the same instant. Sometimes you'll find people with knowledge of modern physics who will raise objections about how the submicroscopic world works and the problems that arise with respect to time at the submicroscopic level. And this really doesn't matter to the metaphysician, because whatever is occurring has to be explained at the very moment that it's occurring. That's why one of the problems that people have in the first way, the proof from becoming, is they think of the movers and the things moved as though somehow one is before the other. And that's why when you're talking about quid movetur ab alio movetur, whatever is moved by another, it's very easy for people to think of it in terms of this thing moves that thing and gets it going, and then somehow it keeps going and hits something else, like billiard balls. The nasty little truth is that I would rather translate it this way. It's not a translation, it's rather an expression that brings out its meaning. Whatever is in motion is here and now being moved by another. Whatever is in motion is here and now being moved by another. That raises the nasty little question, well, what if I take this pen and throw it at you? After it leaves my hand, what's making it move? Momentum. What on earth is momentum? Momentum, or inertia, is a principle given to us by Isaac Newton, which says that a body in motion tends to remain in motion. A body at rest tends to remain at rest. Does that explain why the pen keeps moving through the air? No, it doesn't. No, it doesn't. Everybody thinks it does. If you allow that, then and in fact, curiously enough, Jacques Maritain, in his Principles of Metaphysics, actually readjusts the principle. Not because he did not understand it, but I think because maybe the readers didn't. He readjusts it to say whatever begins motion or changes motion, if there's a change or beginning in motion, something has to change it. Something has to be causing it. Something has to be moving it to change it. Just to take perhaps into account the objection of momentum or inertia. But the fact of the matter is that a body in motion, here and now moving by momentum or inertia, still needs something to move it. No, you're not. If I throw this at you, once it leaves my hand, I have nothing further to do with it. It'll hit you anyway. Flying through the air, does it need a cause? You bet it does. I know, see, that sounds strange. I wrote an article on this in Faith and Reason back in the early 1980s. That's entitled A Variation on the First Way of St. Thomas. Because you see, the curious thing, guess who tells us that something has to keep it moving? Newton. Newton himself, in his Optics, writes that there has to be a force that keeps the object in motion.
Does he name it?
He doesn't name it, but he says that, as far as I know, but he says there has to be a force that keeps it going.
Do you know what it is? Are they pulling us along here?
No.
Do you know what that force is?
He's thrown us.
Well, I'm not trying to say what Newton had in mind. I'm not perfectly sure. I suspect what he may have had in mind.
No, I meant when you said it's not the momentum or the inertia, it's something else.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, do you know what this something else is? I mean, can you tell us that?
It has energy, it has kinetic energy.
What's kinetic energy?
Energy in motion.
Uh-huh. We're not chasing our tails here? You've got to realize that these physical laws are mere descriptions. All they're doing is telling you how things are. They don't tell you why they are. That's the role of philosophy or metaphysics. All that Newton's saying, based upon empirical observation and an extrapolation from limited data, that a body in motion keeps moving. But he doesn't explain why. But he had the intelligence to know that it didn't explain itself, which most of his disciples, unfortunately, do not realize. His modern-day disciples don't understand what he was trying to say. The reason that you need something to explain it is because when an object is in motion, it is constantly changing its spatial relation to other objects. That's a constant change. A constant change. It is constant, in terms of what I was talking about earlier, new being. It's constant new expressions of reality. Not like you're getting a new substantial being. You're not getting a new chicken or something. But you're getting a new real relation between the position of the particle or planet or star here as opposed to there. If there was no real difference between the two positions, there'd be no motion. Everything would be still. If there's a real difference between the two positions, then there's something real in one that wasn't in the other. And if there's something real in one that wasn't in the other, there has to be a reason for that difference. And that reason is constantly explaining new positions all the time. So you need an external reason, what we call a cause, to explain the constant newness being expressed by an object in motion. Otherwise, it isn't really moving, as Parmenides would say. That's why Parmenides says motion's an illusion.
Standing still and moving.
It wouldn't matter, because you still have a relative difference to explain. But it is true, if one's standing still and the other's moving, it's not the same thing as the other standing still and the first one moving. And that's why Einstein was wrong. In his relativity theory, he assumes it makes no difference which one's in motion. But either one's in motion and the other isn't, or the other is in motion and the first one isn't, or they're both partially in motion relative to the other. And you still have to explain the difference. Notice again, all this is a matter of applying being. Where does the being come from? What's it grounded in? Bodies in motion, remaining in motion, are described by Newton, correctly perhaps, but that doesn't explain why reality is working that way, why it continues to work that way. You might rather suspect that there is some kind of a universal mover keeping things in motion, moving. According to their proper nature, yes, but the nature is operating, and as it operates, it needs an explanation of its operation. What you have to keep in mind is the constant newness that is taking place all the time as something moves.
Is that what you're getting at, the nowness?
Well, I mean newness, literally. The position of one. Let's say you've got two particles, X and Y. X is at position 1 here, it goes over to position 2 here. This is really different than this. Let's say this is the before, this is the after. This is the old, this is the new. If you're going to tell me there's no difference in reality between the new and the old, then nothing's happening. It's all a fantasy. If motion or change is really taking place, then there's got to be a real difference between the after and the before, which means there's something new, some new reality in the after that wasn't in the before.
Not in the essence of it, though.
Doesn't have to be in the essence. It can be accidental. I don't care what it is.
Doctor, I got it. The difference is the accidents.
That's fine. I don't care what type of reality we're dealing with. I told you the examples don't bother me. We're dealing with existence here.
That'd be a logical or good.
This could be, all this is that when you're talking about mere motion, you're talking about an accidental change. Relative disposition in space. But it can make a huge difference in terms of what's going on in the real world.
Is there motion in eternity?
Doesn't have to be. Motion is primarily, as we think of it, applied to the physical world. And the examples of momentum are clearly physical. So that would be a different issue. You'd have, what you're talking about is what's heaven like, and I don't really want to go there at this moment. If there are physical parts to it, you're going to have change. That's fine. But wherever you have physical change, this applies. You've got something here, something new, some new aspect of being that wasn't there before. Because if it wasn't there before, there's no difference between the after and the before.
An aspect of being, are you talking about the object?
I'm always talking about being. That's all I get paid to talk about.
But I'm going back to Sister Ruth's question where Newton said there was something else. And I think what the entire room is wondering is, what is the something else precisely?
I don't know. I never really gave much thought to it. I figured that was Newton's business. But if it,
No, what I'm going to say with Newton, but
Philosophically speaking.
how does the metaphysician defend?
this is a basic law of the way that the world works. But to have a law, you need a lawgiver. So ultimately, of course, it's God. That's your prime mover. I'm just saying that in the prima via, the first way, you've got to understand that applies even to momentum, even to inertia.
So God, your answer is God is the prime mover, therefore anything that begins to move is moved, even if it's just by you, who were caused by God in the first place. When you throw that pen, it's maintained by God.
Ultimately, maybe he's using some intermediate causes. I don't know, that's his business, but it's ultimately got to be God. In fact, you can apply this, you can get a proof for God's existence. In fact, that's what's in my article. You can get a proof for God's existence out of this just by looking at the whole world and asking you how come anything's new. At any given moment, any newness. But many times people use the objection that momentum or inertia is an exception. I'm just saying it isn't. That's all.
Padre Pio, like, he had the ability to be, like...
By location?
Yeah. Yeah.
That's pretty neat.
Yeah. And...
Double work.
You get more done.
Does
Yeah.
it get double time?
Remember that God can do all kinds of stuff if he wants to. Okay? So it's not a problem.
No.
If it happens, no, somebody's doing it. Remember, I'm only arguing that there's got to be a cause. I'm talking about the metaphysical principles at the most universal level. And I'm just trying to get you to see they really are universally applied to everything. There are no exceptions. Nothing is an exception to the rule. Which raises a question of how do we know these principles are really transcendentally valid? How do we know that they apply to absolutely everything? No exception. How do we know that from our little puny finite intellects in this human being with this limited experience of this world that I have at this moment? How can I be so blamed sure that principles apply to everything? This is an objection that some of you know was raised a couple weeks ago. How do we know that these principles really can be applied even to God? Of course, bear in mind, God is the ultimate being, and therefore the basis for the application of the principles.
I'll say sense becomes nonsense. Nonsense.
If what?
If the principles
Oh, if they're not transcendental?
of reason don't apply.
Well, the question is, why are we so blamed confident about them? I mean, what if I were to say, I'm thinking of something on the other side of the cosmos, 20 billion light years away. I'm not telling you anything about it, and I don't even know for sure if it's there. What do you know about it?
Oh, the answer better get back here. He cuffed out.
Coward! Can I ask somebody else?
Well,
I took that away.
Well, we start by saying that you don't know if it's there.
But you know a lot about it. You really know an awful lot about it. I know that if it's there, it is what it is. It cannot both be and not be. It must have a sufficient reason for being. If it's not its own sufficient reason, something else is. I know all that about it. How am I so blamed confident of that?
We walk through this. First of all, you see it.
You better run.
I put it on the other side of the universe.
Right, but you still see something that arrived after 45 million years.
No, I didn't say that.
Okay.
I never said that.
He said, I'm thinking of it.
I gave you nothing. I gave you a hypothetical.
So how do you know it exists?
I didn't say you did. I said it might or might not exist.
So you're thinking of something that might or might not.
Yeah, but what I know about it is if it does exist, all of these metaphysical principles apply to it. Question is, how can I be so sure? That's,
That your principles?
yeah, that they apply.
Principles apply.
That's the problem of the transcendental validity of these metaphysical principles. How do I know that they can apply to everything?
And that's what the question
It's
was.
not sufficient
Because
to
they're-
apply it
that-
to certain things.
No, because what you know would seem to apply only to those things. Let me give you a kind of a analogy drawn from our friend Immanuel Kant.
Is this gonna be true?
Oh, absolutely.
Oh, I mean,
I'm just using the Kantian style. I'm not using Kant himself.
okay.
Kant gives us universal principles of perception and understanding that are a priori universal, applying to all possible experience. And these general principles are guaranteed to be universally true because they're built right into the intellect of man, just the way the mind works. Now, not being Kantians, we have a problem because we have to get our data from the immediately experienced object, which actually is, first of all, a sensed object. Now, let's say I brought in a chicken here and set it up on this lectern, and let's say you've never seen a chicken before in your life, and I put this up here and I say, look, here's a chicken. Now observe it, and you observe it for a few seconds. You don't get to know everything about it. You don't penetrate the depths of its essence, but you get enough out of it. You abstract enough intelligible content to tell the difference between it and a rattlesnake. Now, what if I were to tell you, okay, there's something out in the hallway, and it too is a chicken. Now, do you know anything about it?
Yeah.
Sure you do, because whatever it is that somehow constitutes the nature of chickenness here, that you've already encountered, you know that's going to apply to that thing out there. Now, what if I were to tell you, why? Because what you've already learned about chicken, to paraphrase Kant, holds good for all possible chickens. And if a thing out there is a chicken, then you know something about it. It's got chickenness. If it's not a chicken, you don't know anything about it. In terms of being a chicken, you're kind of chicken about your knowledge.
That's what Dr. Waters.
I knew you'd think of that. Well, I'm substituting for him. I can't keep up with him. So, if I told you there's something out in the hallway, but it's not a chicken, what would you know about it? You'd say you wouldn't know anything about it, right? But here's the thing. What if I tell you that there's a being in the hallway? Here's the thing. Whether you have encountered a chicken or a horse or a quantum or a planet, from the very first moment of your existence, and I dare say even in your mother's womb, from the first experiential content of anything, you not only have a knowledge of some whatness, essence, quiddity, nature, but you also have knowledge of something there. Dasein, being there, something. And from that, just as you abstract the notion of chickenness, you have already encountered the notion of being. Therefore, anything that's out in the hallway, even though you don't know its nature, you don't know what it is, if I say it's there, it will obey the fundamental principles of being.
That's a projection of the structure of our mind.
I'm not following Kant here. I'm using Kant's language. I'm using Thomistic realism.
You're going back to the womb to say that this is where we experience being.
Well, it seems to be the first time we encounter it.
Right.
And it
Right.
may...
Therefore, the brain, the mind structures itself around that experience.
I wouldn't say it structures itself around it, but remember, it is a potential, it's a faculty, a potentiality that is actuated by the content of its object. And since you have passively received in the intellect's mode of universal understanding the nature of not just chicken but being, that then is already in you. And just like once you know a chicken, you know every chicken. Once you know a being, you know every being. Because what's out there? 10 billion light years away. I don't know if it's there or not. But if it is there, it's a being. Now, the problem with the chicken out in the hallway is it might not be a chicken. And therefore it might not obey the laws of chickenness. But there's nothing out there that isn't a being. And you know it's going to obey the laws of being. And that's why you don't lay awake nights worrying that maybe the principle of non-contradiction won't work someday.
But forgive me if this is, I'm totally off here, but I get it. Is this a projection of the structure of the mind? In other words, you're saying we know these things are true because they match our minds.
No, I'm saying that the mind
has received and responded to it.
from the object. We get the content from the object.
We get the sense impression from the object
From which we abstract the universal
abstract the
content.
universal
That's right.
Right.
That's right. But you've got to remember, unlike Kant, the realist position is you're getting the content from the object. The object is specifying the content of the understanding. So if you never experience being, you wouldn't know anything. But that's kind of obvious. But the first time you experience anything, you form the concept of being. Your mind may penetrate more deeply, as we do in metaphysics, trying to understand the full implications of that experience. But that's why I submit nobody lays awake night worrying that somehow out there in outer space, things just sort of happen and there's no reason why. The principles apply.
But aren't you positing a certain infallibility to what?
There is a natural infallibility. There is a natural metaphysics of human intelligence. The intellect works this way. And that's why nobody in practice can ever deny these things. Even those who try to theoretically deny them wind up with egg all over their existential faces.
Because that's what they do. They question that very basis.
Well, of course, but they also wind up saying silly things like trying to say things.
Could I simply say, if I know a chicken being, and then you tell me there's something out there that's not a chicken, it's a something other being? Can I just say
Sure.
say it that way?
I don't know anything of its nature.
Right, but it's a something being.
But it will obey the laws of being.
Because it's
chickenness.
Well-
Because I can apply those principles to whatever's out there.
Right, at the existential principles, the metaphysical principles, not the principles of nature. So you could run into things, our knowledge is terribly, radically limited by the fact that we only know through 5 senses. So that's why everybody tends to be a materialist. It's hard to overcome materialism. It's all we perceive. People say, well, I only believe what I can see, touch, taste, feel, and so forth, which of course is total nonsense, because 95% of the physical world is beyond the range of the senses, as any good physicist knows. One final point before we take a break. There are some modern thinkers, not just natural scientists, but even philosophers. For example, Charles de Koninck, who taught me, who argue that when you're dealing at the subatomic level, using quantum mechanics, using the principle of uncertainty, Heisenberg, the so-called Danish school, that at that level, the metaphysical principles don't apply. All that applies is statistical probability. I can recall standing up at a blackboard at the University of Notre Dame some 45 years ago, arguing with Charles de Koninck on this point. Of course, I was a young graduate student who knew nothing. And we were up there for about 15 minutes going back and forth on this point. And I remember a very well-known philosopher who was also teaching there at the time, sitting in the back, raising a question, and at one point de Koninck got so animated he said, "Oh, shut up," I won't say the name, "you don't know what we're talking about." He's well known though. And finally, he finished me off by saying, when I was your age, I held the same position you do, but since that time I've read John of St. Thomas and concluded that I was wrong. There isn't much more a graduate student can say at that point except sit down. All I can say is I'm about 10 years older than de Koninck was when he died, and I'm still holding the same position. Why, though? What is the point? How do we know these principles obtain down there in the subatomic world? These are principles of being, not essence. Chickenness is essence. Size is essence. Big and little is essence. It doesn't matter how big the object is or how little the object is, the metaphysical principles apply universally and certainly. It's no different than talking about an object on the other side of the universe. And if you understand the uncertainty principle sufficiently, you realize it is simply an epistemological limit on our technical ability to calculate momentum and position at the same time. And I think that even Werner Heisenberg realized that after a few years. But you meet a lot of people today reading Heisenberg, and even philosophers, particularly those of what is known as the Laval School, who follow the interpretation that de Koninck held. In fact, primarily because Charles de Koninck was the primary creator of the Laval School. But he was doing it in the early 1940s, and he was very much influenced by the work of the Danish physicists, de Broglie and Heisenberg and so forth, that had been doing their work in the early 1930s. And that's where he got this, and most of his disciples today still follow the same track.
This filters down. This is the problem. This then filters down into everything. Uncertainty about everything, an inability to know anything.
And
you can't know because on subatomic level, we know that the observer changes the blah blah.
Right.
That whole thing.
There are ongoing discussions even right now in first things. And there are positions that are being danced back and forth about, and the difficulty is this, that the people holding the Laval explanation have a problem with divine providence, because ultimately God wouldn't know what's going on at the subatomic level. It's a disaster. Before it gets worse, let's take a break.